But once Thank you, Brandy. Once again, I want to welcome everyone on behalf of the Apartment and Office Building Association of Metropolitan Washington. We very much appreciate you joining us today. My name is Brian Gordon. I'm the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs here at AOBA, and we're very excited to unveil for you our recently released paper examining the state of multifamily rental housing in the district. Specifically, we focused on the residual impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on rent-controlled and market-rate affordable housing. And I believe that everyone who received the invitation to today's event should have also received a link to the document. But just in case, we'll also drop a link in the chat here for anyone who wants to access the full report. Perhaps obviously from the title of the paper, A Looming Crisis, what we found in our examination was a critical segment of our housing stock that is in significant financial distress, to the point that it poses an existential threat to many communities and to the district's overall affordable housing picture. It's our sincere belief and fear that without immediate governmental intervention, we could see a widespread failure of DC affordable housing providers, bringing with it severe negative consequences for residents, for our overall housing stock, and for the district itself. So in the short time that we have this morning, I'll be walking you through a high-level overview of our findings and what we believe must be done to correct the course on which we're currently headed. But we're also joined today by Zachary Huke. Zach is the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer for CIH Properties. They are a mission-based housing provider that's been operating market-rate affordable communities here in the district for over 50 years. So once I give you sort of that nutshell of our findings, he'll jump in as well to provide a personal account of the scope and magnitude of the issue, as well as how the compounding tenant delinquencies that we're seeing are impacting the operation of affordable housing communities. And of course, we'll leave a little bit of time at the end for question and answer as well. So to jump right in the limited time we have here today, I'm not going to go into every detail of the paper, but suffice it to say that you'll find a lot of really good data and charts compiled from various different sources, much of it affirming what we already know, that the district suffers from a dearth of rental housing options, particularly as it relates to units affordable to residents who fall below the area median income. In particular, Brandy, if you could advance to the next slide, I'd call your attention to the chart on page 7 of the document, showing that households making anywhere less than the area median income of $101,722 a year are virtually assured to struggle finding affordable housing options that don't place them into the category of housing cost burdened. I will say the district is to be lauded for the strides it's made during the last few years, actually exceeding its housing production targets. We've seen a surge in building over the last 4 to 5 years, fueled by low interest rates and abundant financing. But unfortunately, all signs are pointing to a sharp drop-off in new housing construction, as those very same factors that drove the building boom have dried up and now threaten to exacerbate the supply and demand imbalance that drives our housing affordability challenges. As evidence of this, we've seen housing starts for multifamily projects drop 73% in the first quarter of 2024, portending a rough road ahead. So all of that is to say, these figures really just underscore the imperative of maintaining our existing housing stock, and that the district can ill afford any loss of housing units, especially those that are serving our less affluent residents. But getting into the real crux of the issue, as I noted earlier, what we found is that this segment of our housing stock, which the Council of Governments, the district itself, and numerous other groups have all recognized as being in dangerously short supply, finds itself in serious financial distress. Just as the pandemic was regressive in its outcomes along economic lines, hardest hit within the rental housing industry were those properties serving lower levels of the area median income. Many of the providers of these properties, we have learned, still face mounting hardship attributable to massive and unsustainable tenant delinquencies that continue to accumulate today. As the Washington Business Journal recently reported, the wave of multifamily foreclosures has already begun. And what we're seeing is that this may just be the very tip of the iceberg. Without corrective action, we may be facing a catastrophic failure of our rental housing providers catering to that critical market segment. Brandy, if you might advance the slide one. The challenge is, as we're seeing it right now for these communities, is that they're being squeezed on both ends of the balance sheet. The rental housing industry has not been immune to the inflationary pressures of the past few years, as the costs of providing rental housing have truly skyrocketed since 2020. And as you can see from the chart here, many of the rental housing industry's primary cost drivers have grown at a rate far in excess of CPI. Real estate taxes we've seen increase by approximately 10%. Property insurance has gone up by 26% in this last year and is projected to increase by another 50% in 2024. Water and sewer rates increased 34% October 1 of last year. And it's right here that I think I'll kick over to my colleague, Fran Francis, who can speak very quickly to the incredible increases that we're seeing on the utility side.
Good morning, everybody. Yes, you can see from this chart that electric rates have gone up 28.2%. Actually, it's a little bit higher. And that is just for the first 50% of your bill, which are rates that Pepco has implemented already. It is not counting the competitive rates that you pay for the other 50%, or that some customers are paying through standard offer service. You can, just another statistic, that from calendar year 2020, if Pepco gets all of its requested increase that is currently being considered by the DC Public Service Commission, master metered apartment rates will go up over 96%. Again, that's just on the distribution rates. These are enormous increases that are currently being considered, and we are in the middle of litigation. Don't know what will happen with that, but they're very large increases. You can also see that the gas rates, 19%, that rate increase was effective January 19th. And I have been told that we will be getting another request for another increase in gas distribution charges sometime this summer. So that means rates will go up again sometime next year. These are rate increases that are continually being requested by both Pepco and Washington Gas without an end in sight. Brian, back to you.
Thank you, Fran. And those are obviously really significant numbers, and all of these line items create a real strain on the operation of a property, particularly in the affordable housing space where the margins are already so thin to begin with. But when you combine that with what we're also seeing as a crisis in rent collection, it creates a perfect storm type of situation. The bottom line is that when housing providers aren't able to collect the rent, residents will inevitably see a reduction in services, a deferral of planned capital investments, and over an extended period of time, as reserves are depleted, housing providers are ultimately going to begin defaulting on their financial obligations. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now in the market. Brandy, can you advance the slide, please? AOBA conducted a survey of its member companies who own and operate dedicated and market rate affordable and rent controlled apartment housing in the district to try to determine the scope of the problem. We received responses from 5 housing providers representing 13,788 dedicated and market rate affordable and rent controlled units across 126 properties located in all 8 wards. So this is a small sample size in terms of the number of companies, but a really significant footprint in terms of the number of units represented. Combined delinquency loss amongst these respondent housing providers was nearly $13 million. This is an astonishing 6-fold increase over pre-pandemic levels. And Brandy, if you can jump to the next chart, what we found is that this is attributable not just to a higher incidence of delinquencies, but to the levels of delinquencies that are being accumulated by each individual tenant. We've provided within the document some pretty egregious case studies, but as you can see from this chart, the average across the 5 housing providers' affordable and rent-controlled portfolios for largest tenant delinquency was $53,321. Each of the companies we surveyed provided numerous examples of tenants with these high levels of unpaid rent. And again, we're talking about units with rents well below the market average. So these figures actually represent tenants that have literally gone years without paying rent. Brandy, can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So what we found is that these extreme delinquencies are actually a result of the elongated legal process that ensues when a tenant is unable to make their rent payment. What once took 3 to 5 months from beginning to completion can now easily run well in excess of a year, and depending on the circumstances of the case, in excess of 2 years. Systematically, we've seen delays and continuances built into the legal process. And though this was meant as a humane approach to try to give residents additional time, this actually is counterproductive when what's truly needed is early intervention to get residents the assistance they need to reach consented settlement agreements with housing providers, allowing them to stay in place before those arrearages grow to such an unwieldy level. Policies that we saw that were well-intended and even practical during the early stages of the pandemic to protect against a mass wave of resident displacement in the midst of a global public health emergency are now producing harmful outcomes under today's very different circumstances. And the result is an accumulation of debts that can't reasonably be redeemed. It's digging both residents and their communities into a deeper and deeper financial hole. And having now reached what we can only describe as a crisis point, these policies are long overdue for revisitation and revision. And that's exactly what we're going to be recommending here. And I think you can advance to our final slide there, Brandy. What we're looking for is changes to the legal process that would stop the compounding of rent delinquencies, help residents get back onto solid financial footing, and allow housing providers to resume collecting the revenues that are so critical to maintaining the operation of these vital communities. First and foremost, we're calling for additional capacity. News 4 recently reported that 13 of the 62 Superior Court judgeships are currently vacant. Filling these positions would make a significant impact in terms of improving the efficiency of scheduling and conducting those court proceedings. Secondly, we believe that all parties would benefit from a greater availability of pre-initial hearing voluntary mediation with the intent of securing an eviction diversion. This would effectively move mediation to the front of the process, get all parties to the table, and hopefully produce consent settlement agreements, avoiding the need for further litigation, and hopefully, over the long term, reducing evictions. Similarly, we believe that protective orders should be issued to ensure that payment of rent on a prospective basis is made, while preserving the ability of a tenant to contest the amount owed or allege code violations or services not rendered as part of the initial hearing rather than as part of a separate Bell hearing. This will again prevent delinquencies from accumulating to unredeemable levels. Another issue that we heard a lot about in our research was the ERAP application loophole, which can add months and even years to the legal process. The Tenant Safe Harbor Amendment Act removed the discretion of judges in granting a continuance when a tenant simply fills out an application for ERAP assistance, regardless of the availability of such funding, whether the tenant meets the income qualifications, or if the tenant even carries a balance that can be covered by the program. We've seen sometimes multiple continuances granted in a single case, adding months and months to the legal timeline, and the judge's hands are essentially tied. Tightening this up would make a significant difference in reducing the type of extreme delinquencies that are having such a deleterious effect on our affordable housing communities. Additionally, we recommend returning to the pre-pandemic Court of Appeals precedent, wherein case review would be confined to matters which prejudice the case against the defendant. So discretion should be restored to the judges to grant continuances or throw out cases as they deem fit, rather than for trivial reasons or for mere technicalities. And finally, we believe the district should look to assist struggling providers of affordable housing by relaxing regulatory burdens such as building energy performance standards. Within the document, we've outlined the cost pressures that are facing the industry. Any additional costs at this time in this environment represent a challenge in terms of maintaining the operations of the property, the quality of the housing, and even continuing to meet the property's financial obligations. So that's essentially the very down and dirty, quick snapshot of our research paper. But as I noted at the outset, we're joined today by Zachary Huke, who can from a property level, provide a little bit more personal insight into the scope and magnitude of the issues that we're seeing in this critical market segment.
Yes, thank you, Brian. That was very well done. Appreciate you, your presentation and taking the lead on this research paper. Very happy to be here personally, actually, to help spread awareness of what we see as a crisis unlike one we've ever seen before as a company. Yes, my name is Zachary Hugh. I'm the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of CIH Properties. CIH was founded 50 years ago by my father, Mike, who had a vision of providing quality, affordable housing to the working residents of the District of Columbia. We're an investment company. We hold multifamily properties for the long term. And in fact, we've never sold a property, seeing operations through various business cycles over the decades. We've been members of the Ward 7 and Ward 8 communities since 1986, when we purchased and rehabilitated Friendship Crossing apartments on Galveston Street. Friendship Crossing was devastated by the crack epidemic in the early 80s, and it took extreme commitment by CIH to keep from losing the property completely. We worked with DC city officials and even the federal marshals to prosecute crack dealers, including testifying in open court at great personal risk to ourselves. Today, CIH owns and manages a modestly sized portfolio of 2,400 affordable housing units with a concentration in Ward 7 and 8. We still operate with the same mission: to provide safe, clean, and affordable housing to the working residents of Washington, D.C. We keep our company at this size because we know how difficult this mission is, given much lower revenues than other types of housing product, and frankly, higher expenses. We need to stay very lean and efficient to be successful, and we're operators and practitioners at heart. In fact, I'm at one of our properties right now where I work 3 days a week on the front lines, trying to manage our way through this latest crisis. And I can say unequivocally that CIH has never faced a crisis like the one we're faced with today. In fact, the DC affordable housing community, here we are in June 2024, is facing an existential crisis of survivability. The magnitude and the speed with which this crisis is unfolding is not yet known by the general public, the mayor, and other public policy officials. So I'm so pleased to be a part of a presentation to you all this morning. This research white paper was exceedingly well written by AOVA. It's long and comprehensive, and it does a masterful job describing the problems, identifying root causes, and providing concrete solutions. I'm speaking today as a representative of the DC affordable housing industry, but I wanted to share with you our personal experience from here on site. Over the past 2 years, we have experienced a spike in delinquency losses and a subsequent collapse of cash flow that threatens the solvency of many of our properties. This situation is without precedent in our 50 years. By way of example, in 2019, before COVID, tenant receivables, which are rent owed for all residents past and present across our portfolio, was just over $500,000. Today, that number stands at more than 6 million. Let me say that again. Our modest portfolio of 2,400 units is owed a staggering $6 million from residents. And most of this receivables balance has built in the last 2 years. At one property alone, the top 50 residents with the highest balances owe over $650,000, with the highest balance reaching over 50 grand. And out of those 50, only 6 made rental payments in May. These are folks suffering a suffocating debt load that have essentially given up. The devastation of losing rent payments from 20% of your resident base and the loss of all of that rental income is hard to exaggerate. And the problem is unfolding before our eyes. The worst collections month since COVID, and indeed in CIH's 50-year history, was last month, May 2024. And this crisis is not just a CIH one, it's an industry problem. Most affordable housing communities are suffering similarly. This is not a property-specific issue, as exemplified by the case studies reflected in the white paper. Whenever we talk to other housing providers, we hear the same story. There's a collections crisis that is threatening the very viability of affordable housing. I'm speaking as a spokesperson for the industry today. The root cause of this crisis is the legislation passed and the regulations implemented during the COVID public health emergency. But the public health emergency and COVID crisis has long since passed. Lawmakers and other officials must restore the housing provider-resident relationship to its pre-COVID natural balance. The laws and regulations passed in March of 2020 suspended evictions and at the same time offered massive rental assistance to residents. This offer of rent payment was well-intended and appropriate for the time, but offering nearly unlimited rental assistance over an 18-month period ultimately sowed deep confusion in the market about the amount of and the period of time for which rental assistance could be available. Simultaneously, the suspension of due process and access to the courts eliminated the natural correction mechanism for missed rent payments, which are legal warnings and legal recourse. Naturally, many residents took advantage of Stay DC, which paid out a staggering $352 million in federal rental assistance grants. Of course, Stay DC dried up after about 18 months, but the rent responsibility ambiguity and the confusion still persisted. Many residents still had expectations of rental assistance and heard about so-called ERAP, so payment patterns did not change much. Very soon, without rental assistance from the city and the magnitude of Stay DC, resident losses and debt balances grew and properties losses spiked. In the meantime, although the courts had officially reopened, they did so under a new set of rules, including onerous notice and administrative requirements, long wait times to see judges due to the large backlog of cases, and case continuances and even dismissals as a matter of course for administrative and paperwork oversights that might have had no bearing on the merits of the case. The time frame to resolve landlord and tenant non-payment has more than tripled since before COVID, taking up to 24 months or more. Practically speaking, housing provider access to judicial enforceability of lease agreements has been suspended. This is where we find ourselves today. And although these COVID laws and new rules for the courts were meant to help the residents of the District of Columbia, they have had precisely the opposite effect. The false promise of rental assistance and the lack of a legal correction mechanism has left thousands of DC low-income residents with suffocating levels of debt. Ambiguous offers of rental assistance and changes to program requirements have left residents unsure of whether the city may or may not pay rent on their behalf. And with assistance aid dropping from an excess of $352 million during COVID to $63 million of ERAP this year, and a projected drop by another 50% in 2025, many residents are expecting or hoping for rental assistance that simply will not be available to them. And without a functional court system to serve as an early warning correction mechanism for the consequences of rent non-payment, residents see their balances grow very quickly. In fact, balances grow in just 3 or so months to exceed a resident's ability to ever hope to repay it. And they will often reject the offer of repayment plans as a result. At this point, many residents give up paying rent completely, waiting for months or even years for the inevitable eviction. Only this can explain the circumstances where 50 residents out of a 400-unit property can owe $650,000 and only 6 of them made rent payments in 1 month. This is a disaster for residents and a disaster for properties. I'm on site at our properties. I talk to residents every day to learn about their circumstances, and I help them devise plans to escape from the suffocating debt and settle cases out of court. And I regularly encounter frustration and confusion. Really, I am serving as a caseworker, calling resident by resident to talk about the circumstances. I sat with a resident on Friday, for example, to try to calculate an affordable repayment plan for her. We discussed her income levels from her new job, calculated rent payments she might be able to afford every 2 weeks, and then even called ERAP together to inquire about assistance and the status of her application. I am serving as a resident case manager, working with them to structure a recovery plan. A suffocating debt load is a disastrous place for a person to be mentally and economically. Unpaid debt balances this large will ruin the credit of thousands of low-income DC residents. The DC court system does not seem to have a focus on the accumulating debt load that residents are building during a legal resolution process that takes months or even years on end. The DC court system may not take debt obligations seriously, but certainly the rest of the world does. And if residents skip or are evicted and balances these large are sent to collections, They could be frozen out of the credit markets for housing, automobiles, credit cards, and the like for many, many years. And while the residents are suffering, the properties are too. Cash flow during this crisis has dropped below levels needed for sustained operations. With historical profit margins in the business as little as 5%, affordable housing simply cannot survive collections loss rates that used to be 2.5% and are now 15 to 20% every month. Revenue must exceed expenses for any business to survive. And when cash flow drops below expense levels, operators are left to triage cash demands to stave off bankruptcy and ruin. The first cut is inevitably the return on investment to investors. And although the investment community is often vilified, it is their productive capital that allows our economy to run, and it must receive a competitive return to stay. The next cut is to expenses that are discretionary in nature. We made the decision to not open the swimming pool at one of our properties due to lack of funds. This was a very difficult decision because we know losing our amenities degrades the quality of the resident experience, but we are forced to triage our cash needs. Similarly, we have eliminated discretionary physical upgrades to common areas and units that would have improved the property. And when there are no discretionary expenditures left to cut, housing providers are left to use operating reserves and future repair reserves to fund operations while deferring more and more projects and services. The faster these reserves are depleted, the more austere the cuts need to be. Eventually, mortgage payments are at risk and bankruptcy is not far behind. The city must become aware of this crisis and do something about it before it's too late. I encourage you all to read this white paper and report on it. You should research its claims. You will find them to be true. You will find that this crisis is very real, very large, and very fast moving. The city needs to act immediately to stem this disaster. As Brian mentioned, the white paper presents concrete solutions that could have an immediate impact. Otherwise, the city risks a return to the bad old days of DC, abandoned buildings, a severely diminished tax base and revenue, and rampant crime and discontent. The residents of Ward 7 and Ward 8 and the residents of the District of Columbia deserve better, and the properties deserve better too. Our properties serve as anchors of stability in Ward 7 and Ward 8. We're stakeholders in this community as much as residents, but too often housing providers are painted as predatory and antagonistic. The simple truth is that we rely on our residents and our residents rely on us. Our employees rely on us. The army of service workers and contractors and small business owners that work on these properties rely on us. And in fact, the city relies on us. Remember, these are naturally occurring affordable properties. Each property in our portfolio is either rent controlled or officially affordable. The average rent in our portfolio is a mere $13.24 per month. The city needs this affordable housing, and they need to take the necessary steps to preserve and protect it. In conclusion, the natural balance of the Ward 7 and Ward 8 housing ecosystem has collapsed. Residents are suffering and housing providers are suffering. The city needs to return this ecosystem back to sustainable balance. We need to return to the pre-COVID condition where rent is paid, residents are debt-free, and properties have enough funding to be maintained and upgraded, and rental assistance is limited to only those of urgent need. The crisis stems from structural changes made to this ısecosystem, and so it's only DC policymakers that can solve it. Housing providers have been left helpless to solve this crisis. There is clear evidence that this is a DC problem due to a DC structure. Neighboring jurisdictions in Maryland and Virginia have returned to pre-COVID performance long ago because housing providers have access to a functioning court system. DC needs to follow suit. The alternative is simply too tragic to consider. If the city lets this system collapse completely, it would take billions of taxpayer funding and a generation to turn around. City officials need to act now before it's too late. Brian, back to you.
Thank you very much, Zach. I think you've very well described the scope and magnitude of this situation. And I will note that as we embarked upon this project, one of the things that we found was that as significant of an issue as we're facing, awareness is not where it should be at this point. I think a lot of people have been very surprised to learn of how significant an issue this segment of our housing market is facing. And so it's our hope that this will help to serve as a trigger for working together with our partners on the council and within the court system to try to address this situation before we face the dire consequences that could lie ahead. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and we're certainly happy to entertain any questions that folks may have. Just to maintain order in that regard, I think it's the reactions button at the bottom of your screen. You should be able to raise your hand, and we're happy to answer any questions. And while we're waiting for that, I will ask Alex if you wouldn't mind posting in the chat just your contact information and my contact information. We will, of course, as I said, be reaching out to our partners on the council and in the court system. But anybody who has any questions with regard to our findings, any additional information you'd like to chat about, can reach out to both Alex and I on the AOBA staff. I see a question. Ted, yes, sir.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for doing this. I'm curious, and I had seen Councilmember Fruman on here. I didn't know, have you had any conversations with folks at council about initiating this process? And have you had any conversations with those at court to see if there can be any streamlining going? I mean, obviously, we're somewhat familiar with the issues that both AOBA and Zach have raised today, but wanted to see sort of where that conversation has gone outside that. Thanks.
Thank you. I would say we've had very initial conversations with some of our partners on the council. Catalin, I'll defer to you on that.
Yes, I think my name is Catalin Peter. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs for our residential portfolio here at AOBA. We've had a number of initial conversations, as Brian said. I think we've set some groundwork. This white paper is our opportunity to put those facts out and to put the case studies out. I think it was very important to show the council members that these are not just general anecdotes. This is something much more serious. And we were also very specific and narrow in the solutions we laid out. Part of that did stem from some of the conversations we had from council members to develop some of those solutions. And we hope that over the summer, we can continue having conversations with each of the council members, in particular members of the housing committee, to reinforce and to go through the details and get that into some form of legislation or in a form of administrative action at the courts.
Got it. Thank you. And I read the Washington Business Journal on the auctioneer and the bankruptcies. Has AOBA seen any of your members file for bankruptcy because of this crisis recently?
I'm not aware that we've had any members file for bankruptcy at this point, but what we have heard, and again, anecdotally in gathering this data, is that they're kind of on the precipice at this point, especially what we've not seen is that we're seeing the collection challenges in market rate in market rate housing, but it's the lower levels of
Got it.
rent. Yes.
Thank you. And how much time do you think, for whomever, and then I'll stop asking questions, how much time do we have to solve this before the crisis becomes even more severe?
Zach, I might defer to you on that one.
Well, certainly it depends on the property. We are conservatively financed as a rule for our company, and we fund large reserves. Other folks don't necessarily follow that same pattern. And so it'll be the properties that simply don't have operating and repair reserves that will see the first signs of real bankruptcy risk or debt default risk. As I say, our worst collections month in 50 years was May 2024. So this is an issue that needs to be addressed immediately, or we'll start seeing, I'll say, dire results, certainly within this calendar year.
You all.
Anybody else have any questions? Okay, and I'm just making sure, again, Alex is going to post our contact information here. I'll put my cell number in here as well. If anybody has any follow-up inquiries, and we look forward to reaching out to, again, our partners. Thank you for being here with us today, our partners in the courts and on the council, to hopefully try to address this very serious situation.
Brian, I saw a question posted in the chat from a direct message.
Thank you.
Sandra Embler's wondering where we obtain the data on the length of the various court actions.
That was through interviews with our membership and actually looking at case studies of the cases that they've filed.
We also worked with attorneys as well to get a better understanding of the cases that they're seeing, that they're working on, and that they're filing.
Well, thank you once again, everyone, for joining us today, and we look forward to continuing this conversation going forward.
Thank you, Brian.